Hi, my name is Richard Menkis, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the second episode of Meet the Author, sponsored by the Association for Canadian Jewish Studies. Our featured author today is Hernan Tesler-Mabé, who is joining us to discuss his wide-ranging and engaging new book, Mahler's Forgotten Conductor, Heinz, Unger, and His Search for Jewish Meaning. Before I tell you more about Hernan and introduce our special guest interviewer, Professor Karen Painter, a few words about the Association for Canadian Jewish Studies. The Association for Canadian Jewish Studies is the only academic organization dedicated solely to the study of the Canadian Jewish experience. Our organization is multidisciplinary, and we encourage interdisciplinarity. We publish the annual journal Canadian Jewish Studies, Études Juives Canadiennes. We also publish a newsletter twice a year and hold an annual conference. Because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we canceled our last conference and decided to inaugurate our online events. In addition to this Meet the Author series, we are organizing a number of online sessions. Our first session, broadcast on July 28th, was on harassment and hate online, realities and remedies. It is now available for viewing on our YouTube channel. Please subscribe to the channel to find out more about upcoming events. At the end of the interview, you will find information on the ACJS, and we strongly encourage you to join the association and support its mandate to deepen our understanding of the Canadian Jewish experience. You will also find information about ordering Hernan's book with a discount code from the University of Toronto Press. It's now my pleasure to introduce our guests. Hernan Tesler-Mabé is currently coordinator of the Varied Jewish Canadian Studies program at the University of Ottawa, where he has taught in the departments of history, communication, and most recently, modern languages and religious studies. Hernan is also the president of the Association for Canadian Jewish Studies. Welcome, Hernan.
Thank you very much.
Our special guest interviewer today is Karen Painter. Karen is a professor of musicology at the University of Minnesota. She is the author of Symphonic Aspirations, German Music and Politics, 1900 to 1945, and has written extensively on Jewish identity in music and anti-Semitism, in particular about the composers Gustav Mahler and Arnold Schoenberg. She is currently completing a book with the working title, The Politics of Mourning, German Music, Poetry, and the Gendering of Loss in the World Wars and Holocaust. Welcome, Karen, and thank you for doing this.
Thank you.
I will be the other interviewer. In addition to serving as the co-organizer of this series of online events with Jesse Toufexis of the University of Ottawa, I am associate professor in the Department of History at the University of British Columbia with a research focus on the cultural history of Canadian Jewry. Okay, Hernan and Karen, I've done the ACJS spiel and the intros, so we're finally past the preliminaries. Hernan, could you start by telling us a bit about yourself, where you were born and grew up, where you've studied, and what drew you to this particular topic?
Gladly. The temptation is to always go too long and say too much, so I'm going to try to keep it brief. So I was actually born in Argentina, in Buenos Aires. My family moved to Canada when I was a wee lad, a small boy, to escape political persecution there. And I grew up in Vancouver, went to UBC, University of British Columbia, to do my first degree in history, and then moved to Ottawa, where I did my master's and PhD in history. In terms of the project, this is actually, it's an interesting one because it's one of those things that I've sort of carried within me for a long time. And really the movement towards studying Jewish things like this, culturally, was always sort of percolating, as it were. But really what ended up happening was sort of a couple of years into my PhD, I started really thinking about the topic more generally, and one day just went to the archives, Library and Archives Canada, and found this collection, this font that nobody had ever opened as far as I was aware. And I found it fascinating, and given my interest in Jewish cultural history, I thought, let's begin exploring this, and from there we built this project.
Okay, thank you. Karen, thank you again for joining, and now it's your turn. Fire away.
Hernan, let's start with your subtitle, Heinz Unger and his search for Jewish meaning. Mahler's music has been a magnet for a passionate search for Jewish identity, including one of the greatest conductors of the 20th century, Leonard Bernstein. How would you contrast Unger's search with Leonard Bernstein's?
That's a good question. I think that there's a couple of things here that are really interesting. For starters, I think the idea of why Mahler attracts so much interest is one of the sort of the key features of this. There are other composers that are born Jewish, raised Jewish, etc. But for some reason, and I'm putting aside people like Schoenberg for the moment, of course, but for some reason, Mahler represents this sort of, for lack of a better term, a perfect storm for study, right? This sort of liminal figure that doesn't fit in any of the categories, and is Jewish sufficiently, or at least deemed Jewish sufficiently. I think we have to explore that a little bit more later, for people to want to pursue and look for Jewish meaning within his music, or see resonances of their own Jewish experience in this meaning. This is why particularly it works in an exploration of Unger, obviously because of his affiliation and connection with Mahler's music. But really what we're also kind of talking about here is that I think Mahler, just to sort of complete that thought, appeals to the modern sensibility of pastiche. I was thinking about this a little bit. Why is this a theme that, or why is Mahler the figure that is often chosen? And I think it is the pastiche element of him, of his life, of this sort of balkanization, dare I say it, of his personality, but also the interwoven nature of his personality. I think that is something that's really key in terms of why people go to Mahler. And secondly, is this mythologization of Mahler in the modern world. And so I think those are the reasons why people are drawn to this subject. In terms of this idea of Unger's particular exploration of Mahler, I think, like I said, the subtitle is there because it very much speaks to the fact that that Heinz Unger was, in many respects, unsure of who he was for long periods, long stretches in his life. And in some way or other, dare I use this phrase, Mahler is not only a mirror, but also a leitmotif of what he is and what he wants to be. And I mean, when we contrast his search for Jewish meaning via Mahler compared to other people like Leonard Bernstein, right, for example, we see that the engagement that Unger has particularly is one that is deep and important for him in a way that perhaps those that had more of a security and confidence in their Jewish identity, they didn't need to seek Mahler out as this foil, this emotional, cultural foil for themselves. I don't know if that answers the question a little bit or not, or if you want to, follow up on any of those elements, I'd be glad to hear them, obviously.
You bring up such interesting points. I guess one way I'd like to follow up is to turn to the beginning, to look at Heinz Unger as a young man conducting the Berlin Philharmonic for the first time in September 1919. He programmed Mahler and Wagner. So for me, the world's greatest Jewish composer and the world's greatest anti-Semitic composer. What was he thinking?
I think that's the heart of it, right? I think that is it, and it's interesting. He has this this program that is his first true program, and as you say, he brings forth the what could arguably be the world's greatest Jewish composer and the world's greatest anti-Semitic composer. These two sounds very weird to say that, but regardless, what this is the sort of the two elements that are contested within him, right? I think this is, like I said, at the heart of it. We used to speak of this term of German-Jewish symbiosis, right? That this was the essence of the Jewish-German experience. We've moved beyond that term for a number of different reasons, but I think at the heart of it is the fact that the shortest way of answering it is this: Heinz Unger was both German and Jewish. And this program spoke to what he was in at the same time, both of these elements at the same time. And I think that is, at like I said, the heart of this crisis of identity that he experiences throughout his life. It is manifest at that moment and then thereafter as well. I think that comes out in the book in a number of different places.
Mm-hmm. Now, to dig more deeply into this idea of Jewish identity for Heinz Unger relative to Mahler, I wanted to ask you to address this term performativity of Jewish identity, which I find so fascinating. And I'm wondering, how can we fruitfully distinguish the idea of presenting one's identity, say the music you program or how you interpret that music, and then the anti-Semitic designation of Jewish traits as inauthentic artistic expression? And I'm wondering how that process worked for Unger.
I think a really important part of this is to sort of cast aside the anti-Semitic trope, right? Of sort of Jewish exhibition of performance. I think if we look at it through that lens, we're bound to sort of descend into a sort of chaotic, a nightmare situation of arguing about whether performativity is for the individual, right? I think in this case, what I meant to focus on with this term of performative right. Sorry, is there a bird in the back, I think, has joined our conversation?
That's my bird, a Minnesota bird.
It's actually tremendously apropos in a conversation about Mahler, isn't it?
That's right.
So when we're talking about a composer like Mahler that is drawn or that draws his inspiration so much from nature, I think that is certainly something that maybe this is Mahler channeling nature, from beyond the grave. The question was, in respect to this performativity, and the issue is that I think oftentimes what we end up doing is sort of getting lost in this understanding of the issue of Judaism versus Jewish, right? And I think, unfortunately, this is sort of derived from the sort of hard line that can be drawn, or that people try to draw between true Jewish religious expression and Jewish identity. And I think what I was trying to get at really was the fact that this sort of, the idea of a performative right was that the performance of Mahler's work particularly, and by that I also mean advocacy for, believe it or not at times, and discussion of and engagement with, this was a type of a sort of ritualistic engagement with his own Jewish identity, with Unger's Jewish identity. I think this is at the heart of it. And the performance aspect certainly is something that, I think that he had as many performers might have, an exhibitionist streak to him, in that he wanted to perform for others, and he wanted to perform his Jewish identity for others. He was desperate, I think, in some respects, to be understood as Jewish. And in fact, when he was not seen as Jewish, he would attack the other violently. And so in some respects, it is sort of a part of this continuum of the expression of his Jewish identity. I don't know if that helps explain this sufficiently or not.
That does, and I'm wondering how that might have changed over time. If we look at Jews who fled Nazi Germany, they had different reactions to German culture and to Judaism. Arnold Schoenberg converted back to Judaism in 1933. Kurt Weill refused ever to speak German again. And I'm wondering about Heinz Unger. Did he become more religious in 1933? What was his relationship to German culture after that point?
I think, again, this is a fascinating question. It's because it goes back to what I was saying. We have to sort of stay away from or be careful of moving too closely to becoming quote unquote Jewish and thinking of it religiously. Obviously, Schoenberg converts back to Judaism, right? Weill, as you said, I believe it was, never speaks German again, right? Heinz Unger certainly does not speak German, if his daughter is to be believed, who I spoke to a couple of times. He never spoke German throughout the Second World War. That was out, not done in the house, even though it was had been a German household. So that was principally sort of the expression during that period. He does not, however, become more religiously observant. Right? There's never this movement towards religious observance in Heinz Unger, and in fact, during the war, he's living in England, right? And in that time, I have very little documentation about really his quote unquote Jewish movements. So he seems to embed himself as a sort of good citizen of the British Empire. Whether that is an attempt to get away from his German roots is a possibility, but he really doesn't move towards any sort of outright expression of that until actually later in his life. In fact, if I were to sort of rephrase your question or reframe your question, I would say his sort of year zero of Jewishness is 1960. And the Mahler centenary, right? At that point, he becomes absolutely categorically and belligerently Jewish in his identity, and he seems to connect more deeply with elements of the community. But he doesn't engage in prayer at any point that I'm aware of. So, yeah.
And that was, of course, 5 years before his death. Mm-hmm. Right. Exactly. Yeah. Turning back to the period when he is living in England and comes and conducts in Canada, I think there was an interview in 1937 when he would not discuss his reasons for leaving Germany. He simply noted the times speak for themselves. And I'm wondering at what point he would openly discuss the Holocaust. Did that change after 45?
He never does. There's not a single thing that I have found where he explicitly talks about that period. He, as you said, in 1937, he says that the times speak for themselves. In 1965, this is literally weeks before he passes away from a heart attack. He is presented the West German Order of Merit for Cultural Achievements Award, I believe is the full translation of it. At that point, he makes what is really his only public profession of that period, and he refers to it as those dark years. I mean, I believe he uses that a couple of times, that expression. He never explicitly engages with the Holocaust. And I think in some respects that is a function of the trauma that it caused. I mean, he lost family members. I know family members were left behind as well. And yet it was something that was not spoken of, which is consistent with a lot of Holocaust survivors as well, isn't it?
Related to that, I'm wondering about his time in London. during Nazi Germany, he founded the West London Amateur Orchestra, I guess from Jewish refugees from Germany and English music students, and they rehearsed in the West London Synagogue. But it seems that their fundraising initiatives did not involve Jewish causes. I'm curious, was this part of his effort to become integrated into British society?
I think that's, yeah. Sorry to cut you off, Karen. I think that's a really key part of it. I think he, later in life when he moves to Canada, he does a similar thing. He founds an amateur orchestra and makes a speech at the intermission about civic responsibility, right? And I think that was sort of his sort of true expression of who he was. That yes, he was Jewish, but he was also someone that moved beyond Jewish circles. And so when he is embedding himself in England during the Second World War, he founds this orchestra. He brings in refugees and gives them this job. Or at least an opportunity to play and embed themselves a little bit in their community and make connections. But the causes that he pursues, you're right, the sort of the moments of charity, the few concerts that they hold, are not for Jewish causes per se. They are for the invasion of, in support of Finland in the wake of Soviet aggression, and then sort of for to help those that have Central European refugees that have emigrated to England. But it's not a Jewish cause. It is more of a wider cause of these Central European refugees, which of course we know there are a great many. They're Jewish, and his orchestra employed them. But it was a cause that was beyond the Jewish explicitly.
You mentioned Hans Unger's conducting in Canada, and that's such a fascinating story in your book. And I'm curious, and I might turn back to Richard for this area of Canadian history. I'm curious how the reaction of Canadians changed from German Jews who fled Nazi Germany to Unger, who came and settled in Canada later in 1948. Were they more welcoming to those who fled the horrors of the Third Reich, as opposed to those who moved to Canada later for professional or other reasons? And I know there's a complicated story as well about the resistance that Canadian Jews felt towards Germans who were Jewish.
Yeah, I think this is going to be one of those things that we have to sort of only touch the surface of, right? Because in reality, Richard knows much better than I the Canadian aspect of this, but I know that immigration into Canada in the interwar period was extremely limited, right? And so the numbers of Jews from Europe that were able to actually settle in Canada, I don't know the numbers on that front, but I think the interesting thing is that when he arrives in the wake of the Second World War, he doesn't come as a German Jewish refugee. He comes as a Briton, right? He has a British passport. His family have British passports, and so as a consequence, he never really embeds himself within that pre-war community very effectively, and it means that on the one hand, he has opportunities to connect with the rest of Canadian society. But on the other hand, it means that he will never really reconcile with sort of the more significant branches, numerically speaking, culturally speaking, I guess as well, but certainly numerically speaking, of Canadian Jewry. And that represents a significant problem, and I think goes a great deal to explain sort of his posthumous neglect. That he didn't make that imprint in that part of society that would allow for others to sort of be interested in his legacy.
Well, I think it's long overdue, but I'm glad that you have changed that posthumous neglect of Hans Unger.
Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Hernan, you say in the introduction to the book that, quote, Heinz Unger's later years in Canada allow us to view Canadian Jewry through a different frame, end quote. What is the frame that you think dominates Canadian Jewish historiography? And how does your analysis of Unger's experiences provide us with a new frame?
Thank you. I think in some respects, this is an excellent question. In another respect, I'm really happy that my book comes at a time when we're evolving away from that. So my understanding historiographically, that is, of Canadian Jewish studies has been one where we've tended to sort of privilege, perhaps understandably, given the numbers and the concentration of these numbers in major cities in Canada. But what we found is that there's an overrepresentation of Yiddish culture, of that sort of Jewish expression. And I think the frame that I'm talking about is sort of twofold. One is obviously the introduction of Canadian or of German Jews into the Canadian Jewish experience, which are numerically is a very small number, but ended up having certainly a really important effect upon the Jewish community thereafter. But also, sort of in a more general sense, the broadening of the category of Canadian Jewish studies. And like I said, when I started working on this as a doctoral student, I think there was a sort of a more narrow understanding of what we should study and why we should study it. I think over the last decade, I've been friends with this project for even longer than that. But over the last decade, I think we've made significant advances in really starting to look at Canadian Jewish studies as a broader field, where we bring in, not only Ashkenazi Jews from Eastern Europe, but Sephardic Jews from other parts of the world, from Africa and so forth. And so I think the question is a great one, but I'm happy that my project is not sort of the only answer to that. It is a broadening generally, breaking of that frame and seeing it expanded. And I am happy to be only a small part of that reframing.
Thank you. Yes, and let's hope that more and more of that reframing will go on. Hernan, one last quick question. I know that you're incredibly busy. You're carrying a heavy teaching load, and you, like all of us, are needing to retool for online courses. You've also stepped up to become president of the Association for Canadian Jewish Studies. However, do you have any new research projects on the go, or at least are there any topics that you'd like to pursue if you had the time?
If I had the time. You're forgetting the very Jewish Canadian Studies program at University of Ottawa too. So trying to get all that has unfortunately severely limited my the time that I have to devote to my own research. That being said, I'm still working on trying to explore sort of the early post-Second World War period in a Canadian context, to sort of resituate, or at least look at the way that we have understood the way that the Holocaust was dealt with across the country. I think that is a really important one. Somewhere in there, I have a dream of at some point talking or engaging more explicitly with issues of time in the Holocaust. And then the third one, which is the most recent project that I hope to be embarking on, is a mapping of Jewish Ottawa, the history of Jewish Ottawa, through three-dimensional models and sort of recapturing the history that is desperately in danger of being lost. And so I'm hoping to work with some other partners on that, and across the university and beyond.
Yeah, so you've got work for a couple of lifetimes.
A couple.
A couple. Okay, Hernan, thank you. This has been wonderful. Thank you for doing this with us.
Thank you very much for having me.
And Karen, thank you so much for taking the time to be a guest interviewer.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Karen.
And I'm Richard Menkis. Please keep watching so that you can find out information about joining the Association for Canadian Jewish Studies, and to get ordering information and a discount code for Hernan's book. Thank you for watching, and stay healthy.